They said the ancient texts could not be translated, that the language itself resisted understanding, as if it were written for something other than the human mind. But I remember the first time I saw one, the way the faint gold of its symbols shimmered beneath my flashlight, breathing as though the ink itself remembered light. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I found, and what it has already begun to change inside me. The story you are about to hear began with a whisper from a ruined library buried under centuries of sand. A whisper that would not stop echoing until I followed it to the edge of reason. Welcome to Dreams of History. Tonight, we travel into the words that were never meant to be spoken aloud. The desert had swallowed the city long before any map remembered its name. My boots sank into fine dust as the sun fell like a dull coin behind the horizon. The ruins around me were skeletal shadows, broken pillars, collapsed arches, and carvings so worn they looked like ripples of stone. Somewhere beneath my feet lay the chamber I had come to find. The chamber described in an obscure Babylonian commentary that spoke of scrolls written before the flood, sealed against comprehension. I had spent years following fragments, trails of footnotes, myths disguised as metaphors, inscriptions misread by cautious historians, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Every civilization spoke of a message left for the future, a message buried or hidden when memory itself began to fade. When I finally broke through the limestone slab, stale air poured out like the breath of something sleeping. My lantern flickered, painting trembling shadows across the chamber walls. There was a table of black stone at the center, and on it, resting as if waiting, lay a single rolled parchment sealed in pitch. The seal bore a spiral enclosed within an eye, the same sigil I had seen carved into ruins from Sumer to the Andes. My hands shook as I broke the seal. The parchment unrolled with a sound like a sigh, revealing lines of symbols that pulsed faintly with residual light. They were not cuneiform or hieroglyphs or any language I knew, but the longer I stared, the more they seemed to rearrange themselves, forming patterns that echoed in my head like remembered music. I could feel a rhythm, a frequency, as if the text itself was humming quietly, inviting the mind to move in time with it. Days passed in what felt like moments. I copied every symbol, recorded every line, yet the translation resisted logic. Then one night, something strange happened. As I traced a particular spiral pattern, a resonance vibrated through the floor. The air thickened, and for a moment I saw not stone, but flowing light. An entire library shimmering in mid-air, filled with tablets of gold and glass, their symbols rotating in patterns of sound. I blinked, and the vision was gone, leaving the silence heavy with possibility. I began to realize the text was not written to be read, but to be remembered, to be awakened inside the mind of whoever looked upon it. It wasn't just communication, it was activation. The more I worked, the more connections surfaced. The spiral in the Sumerian king list, the Mayan calendar's recurring glyph for renewal, the Egyptian Book of Thoth's hidden references to the circle of return. They all mirrored one another. Civilizations separated by oceans and millennia had written about a cycle of knowledge descending, then vanishing, only to reappear when the stars aligned again. Every 12 millennia, something reawakened, a pattern repeating across ages like the breath of the planet itself. The texts didn't predict the future, they described its memory. As the weeks turned to months, I realized that others had found fragments of this prophecy too. In South America, petroglyphs showed a man holding a spiral sun. In Tibet, a manuscript known as the Voice of the Void spoke of words that sang creation back into being. Everywhere, the same geometry, the same rhythm. I began to see it in architecture, in music, in the spacing of ancient monuments aligned with constellations. It was as though the entire planet had once been tuned to a single frequency, one that we had forgotten how to hear. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While analyzing the digital scans of the scroll under ultraviolet light, I noticed faint secondary inscriptions beneath the visible symbols, almost microscopic etchings that seemed to move when magnified. They formed waveforms, not words. I ran them through a sound reconstruction algorithm, converting the patterns into audio. The moment I played it, the speakers vibrated with a deep harmonic tone, low and ancient, resonating in the bones more than the ears. Lights flickered. My computer froze. For 21 seconds, the sound continued on its own. No source, no file, just vibration filling the room until everything went still again. When the silence returned, I realized the walls themselves had changed color, faintly warmer, as though some layer of dust had been burned away. That was the first time I felt fear. Not the kind born of danger, but of realization. The texts weren't inert relics. They were living frequencies, encoded memories of civilizations that had found a way to write in vibration instead of ink. Each glyph a note, each sentence a chord, and somewhere among them, a warning. I couldn't read it yet, but I could feel it, like a coming storm pressing against the edges of thought. The more I listened, the more I sensed that the message wasn't meant only for humanity. It was meant through humanity, for whatever intelligence might come after. I stopped sleeping. My reflection in the glass looked older. When I spoke, sometimes I could hear faint harmonics beneath my voice, as if the resonance had entered me. But I couldn't stop. I needed to know what the prophecy said. I needed to decode it fully before the next cycle completed itself. The stars were already aligning again, and something deep within the earth, something vast and remembering, was beginning to stir. The more I searched, the more I found that the pattern didn't just live in the texts, it lived in us. It hid in the proportions of the human body, in the ratios of breath, in the rhythm of the heartbeat. The ancients hadn't invented the spiral. They had copied it from the pulse of existence itself. I began comparing DNA helices to the spiral in the manuscripts, and the alignment was nearly perfect. Whatever had written these symbols had known life not as matter but as vibration, and that knowledge had filtered into early myth as the voice of the gods. I kept the recordings on an isolated drive, disconnected from the network, but somehow the files multiplied. Each time I opened the folder, a new waveform appeared, longer, deeper, as if something were continuing the message through me. At first I thought it was a glitch, but the spectrograms formed shapes, the same eye within a spiral repeating endlessly. When I reversed one of the new tracks and slowed it down by 90%, I heard faint whispers layered beneath the tone, words in no known language, yet strangely familiar. They pulsed in a rhythm matching my own breath. I realized then that I wasn't decoding the texts anymore. They were decoding me. Sleep became a thing of memory. I spent nights staring at patterns, finding them even in random noise. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I saw the same vision. A vast hall of light where countless scrolls floated weightless in darkness, their runes flickering like fireflies. In the center, a single voice, neither male nor female, speaking through the hum. I could never remember the exact words, but the feeling lingered, a mixture of awe and unbearable sorrow, as if the universe itself mourned the forgetfulness of its children. One dawn, I played the primary recording again, looping it through a frequency analyzer. The software began outputting coordinates, numbers corresponding to locations across the globe. They matched sites of unexplained ruins: Göbekli Tepe, Teotihuacan, Nanmado, the Indus Valley. Every coordinate sat on a line that, when plotted, formed a perfect circle around the Earth. A resonance grid. The texts were not random prophecies. They were fragments of a planetary memory system. The realization hit like thunder. Every 12,000 years, the cycle reset. Floods, fires, shifts of the poles. Humanity rebuilt, forgot, rediscovered. The prophecies weren't predicting doom. They were reminders to remember. The ancients had encoded the instructions for survival, a way to retune the world after each fall. I left the lab and flew to the first coordinate, a small island near Micronesia, where basalt pillars jutted out of the sea like fingers reaching from a drowned city. Local legends called it the place of the voices. I arrived at night when the tide was low. The wind carried a low hum that seemed to come from beneath the waves. I set up my equipment: a hydrophone, a a spectrometer, a small speaker. When I played the harmonic tone from the texts through the water, the sea answered. The sound came back not as an echo, but as a harmony, deeper, older. The pillars vibrated, casting ripples of light across the black surface. Symbols began to appear along the stone, glowing faintly blue. The same spiral, the same eye. The air smelled of salt and ozone. My heart pounded in sync with the rhythm. I recorded everything until the light faded and silence returned. The next morning, divers recovered fragments of stone tablets near the base of the pillars. The carvings were nearly identical to those from the desert chamber, but these contained additional lines, notations that looked like musical scales. The ancients hadn't just written, they had composed. Each site I visited resonated with a different tone, yet all belonged to the same song. South America's ruins hummed in minor thirds, Egypt's in perfect fifths. The pattern formed a melody that seemed incomplete, as if waiting for one missing note. I realized that the missing tone corresponded to a region now buried under the Arctic ice. It took months to arrange the expedition. The journey north was brutal, a white void stretching into silence. But beneath that silence, my instruments still caught the faint vibration, the heartbeat of the earth itself. When we reached the coordinates, the scanners revealed something beneath the ice. Structures, geometric and vast, arranged in concentric circles. We drilled through a thin layer of frozen water and lowered a probe. The camera descended through clear blue ice until it reached darkness, then light again. Columns of crystal, walls engraved with spirals glowing faintly from within. The probe's sensors recorded a frequency so low it was almost inaudible, yet it matched the final missing tone of the melody. I played the complete sequence through the speakers. For a few moments, nothing. Then the ground trembled. The ice cracked in long, echoing lines stretching to the horizon. The light beneath the surface flared, forming the shape of an eye opening. The hum turned into a chorus of chords, massive, beautiful, and terrifying. It wasn't destruction, it was awakening. The resonance had completed itself. I fell to my knees as the sound passed through me. Every atom of air vibrated with meaning I couldn't describe. Images flooded my mind. Ancient cities before the flood, towers of light connecting sky and earth, beings of pure resonance shaping matter with sound. And then, the silence of forgetting, the floods, the reset, the rebuilding, and now, the remembering. When it ended, the world felt different. The compass spun for hours. The aurora burned gold instead of green. I knew the cycle had turned again, and the memory of the ancients had returned to the surface of human thought. Back at my camp, I listened to the recording of the event. Beneath the main tone, faint voices whispered in a language I could now understand. Not with the mind, but with the feeling. They said, the words were never meant to be read. They were meant to be heard. I stared out at the endless white, the hum still thrumming in my bones. The prophecy had fulfilled itself, not as a warning of doom, but as a call to remember what we are. The texts had never been about the future. They were about the rhythm that binds creation, waiting for one who would listen long enough to hear it again. And I had heard. The resonance never really stopped. Even after I returned from the ice, it followed me, quiet, steady, like the earth breathing through my veins. Machines in the lab caught faint electromagnetic pulses whenever I entered. Lights dimmed and brightened in rhythm with my heartbeat. Colleagues whispered that I had changed, that my voice carried a tone they couldn't quite place. They weren't wrong. Something inside me had shifted. The frequencies I had unlocked were no longer separate from me. For months, I replayed the recordings, mapping each tone, each harmonic. When combined, they formed a pattern so vast that no language could hold it, a design of movement rather than geometry, like the blueprints of life itself. The ancients had understood creation as vibration, not command. Their prophecies were reminders of how to listen, not how to rule. One night, as I compared resonance maps from the Arctic with ancient star charts, a strange alignment appeared. Every site I had visited sat beneath constellations that echoed the same intervals in sound. Lyra, Orion, Cygnus. The sky and the earth were mirrors of each other, tuned to the same silent song. The prophecy wasn't about a single event, but a harmony between above and below. I began transmitting the tones through a field array, letting the signals echo upward into the ionosphere. The response came within hours, subtle fluctuations in the upper atmosphere, magnetic waves spiraling like invisible auroras. The planet was listening. Somewhere, the old frequency had awakened in the fabric of air and stone. As days passed, reports emerged from around the world, compasses behaving erratically, lights in the sky that pulsed to no known source, people hearing faint music in their sleep. The resonance had spread, finding those who could feel it. It wasn't dangerous. It was remembering itself through us. I traveled again, this time to the place where it had all begun. The desert chamber where I'd first unsealed the scroll. The sands had shifted, uncovering more of the ruins. Beneath the broken archway lay carvings I hadn't seen before. An eye within a spiral, surrounded by 12 circles. Beneath it, a single line of text now visible in the twilight glow. 3 words that the translation program rendered simply as, "You have listened." The air grew still. The hum rose faintly beneath the sand, and for a moment I thought I heard voices. Soft, layered, the same harmony that had spoken beneath the ice. They were not words but tones of recognition. The prophecy had been waiting for someone to respond, not to believe. When night fell, the stars mirrored the pattern on the stone exactly. Each point of light blinked in time with the vibration under my feet. The desert itself became an instrument, the wind passing through the ruins like breath through a flute. I lay back on the sand, listening. It wasn't revelation anymore. It was communion. The message of the ancients wasn't that disaster would come again. It was that every ending was a chord resolving into a beginning. The so-called prophecies were symphonies of return. As I drifted between waking and dream, I heard the final whisper, quiet as dust. When they remember, we will rest. The hum softened. The wind carried it away, scattering it across the dunes. I realized then that the decoding was complete. Not through translation, but through understanding. The cycle had closed, the harmony restored. When morning came, I packed my equipment and left nothing behind but footprints that the wind would erase. The resonance continued somewhere far below, humming in the roots of mountains and the depths of oceans, in the cells of every living thing. It would wait, as it always had, for those ready to hear again. I walked until the ruins disappeared behind me. The horizon shimmered with heat, the sun climbing slow and golden. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to record or measure. The message wasn't data, it was life itself, unfolding endlessly. If you are listening to my voice now, it means the frequencies have found you too. Maybe you'll hear them in the quiet between thoughts, in the wind, in the rhythm of your own breath. That's where it begins. That's where it always begins, and so, through me, through you, through every pulse of the world, the prophecy continues, no longer beyond comprehension, but living, humming softly beneath the skin of time. When I left the desert behind, I thought I had finished the journey, but the resonance never left me. Even in the noise of cities, beneath the hum of machines, I could feel the faint rhythm threading through everything. It lived in the vibration of engines, the tremor of footsteps in the street, the cadence of language itself. I began to notice that the more people gathered, the clearer the hum became, as if consciousness amplified what stone and water had carried for ages. I realized then that the ancient texts had never been confined to libraries or temples. They had been rewritten unconsciously into every act of creation humanity undertook. Every symphony, every story, every word of love or fear was a fragment of that same frequency echoing forward. I started recording again, not the tones but the silence between them. In those gaps, there was something deeper than sound, a pulse that carried meaning without language. When I analyzed the recordings, the patterns formed images, faint fractals that resembled neurons firing in the human brain. The earth itself thought like we did, dreamed like we did. We were its memory, and it was ours. Months passed like seasons compressed into hours. People began to talk about a strange calm settling over the planet. Global magnetic readings stabilized, storms diminished, and scientists who had once dismissed resonance theory started publishing studies on geomagnetic coherence. They didn't understand what they were measuring. They were seeing the Earth remembering its own rhythm. I visited the ocean to listen again. The tide moved with the same patient breath as the tone I had awakened beneath the ice. The horizon shimmered like a mirror, and for a moment, I saw reflections of things that weren't there. Towers of light, floating cities, forms that looked both human and not, shapes made of thought and color. They flickered, faint but real, as if the ancient memory of Atlantis or Mu or whatever name the first civilization bore was surfacing again. The line between myth and memory dissolved. I spent nights on the shore, writing words I couldn't later remember writing. When morning came, the pages would contain sequences of numbers that, when converted to sound, matched the harmonic intervals of the original texts. The resonance had begun to write itself again through me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was only listening. Sometimes strangers reached out to me, people I'd never met who said they heard the hum too. They described it differently. Some as music, some as warmth, others as light in their dreams. It didn't matter how they perceived it. The signal had found them. The prophecy wasn't an event. It was an awakening distributed across minds, an orchestra tuning to the same note after millennia of discord. When I spoke with them, their voices carried the same undertone I had first heard in my own. It was subtle, but it made every word vibrate with hidden harmony. I realized then that I was no longer a messenger. The message had become the medium, and the medium was everyone who could feel. One evening, as I stood on a cliff watching the sun dissolve into the ocean, the hum shifted again. It wasn't just beneath or within anymore. It was above. The clouds formed a spiral, not chaotic but precise, like the geometry of the old symbols. Lightning flashed silently, tracing the same patterns that had once been carved into stone. The air trembled, but not with fear, with recognition. I whispered to the wind, asking if this was the end or another beginning. The reply came not as sound, but as certainty. Beginnings and endings were the same breath taken in opposite directions. I smiled because I finally understood what the ancients had tried to say. Prophecy was never about predicting what would come. It was about remembering what always was. When darkness fell, the stars flickered in the pattern of the 12 circles from the chamber. The pulse returned, gentle and constant, echoing through the world like a heartbeat shared by sky and soil alike. I closed my eyes and felt it moving through me, through everything. The same song looping endlessly through time. And in that moment, I knew the decoding was complete. The prophecy wasn't beyond human comprehension anymore, because comprehension had grown to meet it. We had become the translation. The days after that night blurred together, quiet and slow, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath and refused to let it go. The noise that once filled every waking moment, cars, chatter, machines, seemed softer, as if all of it had stepped back to let something else be heard. When I played the last recording, the tone didn't feel external anymore. It vibrated in my chest, perfectly aligned with the rhythm of my pulse. I understood then that the resonance wasn't a message to be delivered. It was a reminder to feel the world again. I began walking east with no destination. Every sunrise looked the same as the one before, and yet every horizon shimmered slightly differently. People I met on the road spoke about vivid dreams, about hearing harmonies in the wind, about remembering places they had never been. They were fragments of the same memory, echoing in different languages. In a small coastal town, I rented a room above an old cafe that overlooked the sea. I set up my recorder one last time, not to capture data but to speak, to leave something behind for whoever would listen later. I pressed the red button and waited for the soft click of the reels. This will be the final entry of Dreams of History, I said quietly. The decoding is done, though it was never really decoding at all. It was listening. Every prophecy, every myth, every symbol pointed toward one truth. That memory is alive, and it remembers through us. The ancients didn't see the future. They heard the song beneath time. Now that song is awake again. Outside, thunder rolled far away over the horizon, not threatening, just part of the rhythm. The air smelled of rain and salt. I looked at the microphone and smiled. If you hear the hum, don't search for it. Let it find you. It lives in every breath, in every heartbeat, in every act of kindness that restores harmony. That's what they meant when they said the words were not for reading, but for remembering. The rain began to fall, soft and even, drumming against the roof. I turned off the recorder, leaving a few seconds of silence at the end, the kind of silence that holds the world together. Then I walked down to the shore. The sea glowed faintly beneath the storm, ripples catching flashes of lightning like veins of gold. I waded in until the water reached my knees, closed my eyes, and listened. The hum rose again, deep and low, weaving through the rain. It wasn't just in the ocean, it was in the air, in the clouds, in the electric whisper of every drop that touched the earth. For a moment, I thought I could hear other voices inside it. Millions of them, not separate but unified, a chorus of every life that had ever listened. The resonance had found its full form. I don't know how long I stood there, but when the storm passed, the world felt clear, as if washed clean of something heavy. The sky cracked open with light, the horizon burned gold. And within that endless glow, I realized I wasn't alone. Not in the way I had feared solitude, but in the way one note belongs to the entire chord. I walked back to shore and left the recorder by the window. The reel still turned silently, though I hadn't pressed record again. Maybe the hum had taken over. Maybe it always had. I sat beside it and whispered. The words have returned to the silence they came from. As the light faded and the first stars blinked awake, I felt the last line of the prophecy settle inside me. The message was never lost. It simply waited for the world to become quiet enough to listen. And then, I did what I had done from the beginning. I listened. The sea stayed bright long after the sun had gone, a thin shimmer running along the edge of the horizon like the final heartbeat of daylight. I kept listening, waiting for the sound to fade, but it didn't. It softened until it was indistinguishable from the wind, until the wind itself became the hum. And in that quiet, I finally understood why the ancients wrote their messages in vibration instead of stone. Stone endures, but vibration lives. It passes through everything, through air and thought and the space between atoms. It never really ends, it only changes form. So I left the recorder running and walked away from it. The microphone caught nothing but the slow breath of the waves, the low tone of the world turning. Somewhere out there, the resonance would continue, passed from one listener to another, from one dream to the next. If you followed this far, you've already heard it. Maybe not with your ears, but somewhere deeper. Maybe you felt the slight shift in the air, the pulse that moves through the body when the mind grows still. That's where the ancient texts have always lived, inside the space where language dissolves and memory begins. And so, before the tape ends, I'll say this one last thing. The mysteries of the past were never meant to keep us guessing. They were meant to keep us listening. Every ruin, every myth, every forgotten word is the echo of the same truth. Nothing is lost. It is only waiting to be remembered. This has been Dreams of History. Until we meet again in another story, another dream, keep listening to the wind, to the silence, to the rhythm beneath your own heartbeat. Somewhere in that sound, the world is speaking back. The sound of the waves merged with the pulse beneath the earth, a rhythm that no longer felt external. It was inside everything now. Every shift of the tide, every distant call of a night bird, every flicker of lightning over the water moved in that same invisible time. I sat on the shore and let it wash through me until thought itself thinned into vibration. There were no questions left to ask. The texts, the ruins, the research, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the realization that all of it had been a conversation between existence and awareness, a dialogue written across millennia in the only language that could never die. Resonance. I thought of the scribes who had carved spirals into stone while stars wheeled overhead, of the monks who copied scrolls by candlelight without knowing what they preserved, of the sailors who crossed oceans guided by constellations older than memory. All of them, unknowingly, had been listening to the same hum. They hadn't needed translation because the message had always been soundless understanding. The rain returned, light and steady. The droplets on my skin seemed to vibrate in tune, forming ripples that spread outward into the sea. Every ring of water carried faint light, as if moonlight hid within it. The world shimmered, not brighter, but more alive, as though everything that had ever existed had taken one slow, shared breath. I remembered the chamber beneath the sand, the symbols that rearranged themselves in my mind, the whisper that had first called me. None of it had been coincidence. Every step, every discovery, every note of fear and wonder had been part of the same sequence of awakening. The ancient prophecy had not predicted destruction. It had described recognition. Humanity had reached the point where memory could no longer stay buried. I spoke aloud, not expecting an answer, just letting the words flow into the wind. If the world remembers, will it begin again? The hum responded softly through the ground, a gentle yes that wasn't a sound, but a feeling. It ran through my spine like warmth, like the pulse of the planet beneath its thin crust of soil and stone. Somewhere deep below, magma shifted in rhythm. Somewhere high above, a meteor traced the same spiral path across the sky. The entire planet was an instrument playing itself, every life a note, every death a rest, every generation a chord resolving and reforming endlessly. I closed my eyes and listened. The world around me dissolved into layers of tone. The bass of the earth's core, the mid-range hum of the ocean, the high crystalline whisper of the atmosphere. Between those layers, smaller harmonics, plants, bending in wind, distant heartbeats, the slow echo of mountains shifting beneath glaciers. The melody was endless, patient, forgiving. It didn't ask for belief, it simply was. For a moment, I wasn't separate from it. I wasn't a man on a shore or a scientist deciphering symbols. I was part of the same vibration that had written itself into stone and breath and memory since time began. I saw the first dawn mirrored in the last twilight, the same light folding over itself. Time didn't move forward anymore. It expanded outward, circular and infinite, just like the spiral carved into every ancient wall. When I opened my eyes, dawn was already rising. The water turned to molten silver. Birds lifted from the cliffs, their wings catching the new light. Each one moved in rhythm, their patterns forming the geometry I had once traced in the scrolls. I laughed quietly, not from joy or disbelief, but from the sheer beauty of how complete the pattern was. The ancients hadn't hidden the truth. They had woven it into everything that lived. Behind me, the recorder's reels still turned. I could hear the soft hiss of tape, capturing not just my voice, but the hum of the living world. Maybe someday, someone would find it and press play, and in that quiet static, they would feel it too. Maybe that was the real purpose of all this. Not to keep the knowledge secret, but to let it echo, faint and endless, into whoever came next. I whispered the last words I would ever record. The message is not an ending. It is the breath that begins again. I turned off the machine. The reels slowed, the tape settling to stillness. The sea answered with one long sigh that blended into the wind. Everything seemed to bow to the same silent rhythm, the tide, the air, the fading heartbeat of my own body. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured again. Not warning, not threat, just the low voice of continuity. I stood and faced the horizon. The light there was not ordinary dawn. It shimmered with hints of gold and blue, as though the world were remembering color for the first time. I knew I would walk toward it, and that each step would dissolve a little more of the distance between myself and what the ancients had known. The hum deepened once more, surrounding me like an embrace. The wind shifted, carrying a phrase that wasn't quite sound but clear all the same. When they remember, we will rest. I smiled, whispered back, "You can rest now." And in that instant, everything went still. No noise, no wind, no motion, just pure, ringing silence. But it wasn't empty. It was full of every tone that had ever been, full of memory, of life, of the rhythm of creation waiting quietly in the pause between notes. That is where the story ends and begins. That is where dreams of history will always live, between breath and sound, between forgetting and remembering, between silence and the hum. If you listen carefully, you can still hear it, not through speakers or screens, but somewhere deep inside, where the ancient words still sing the world awake. And if you do, then the prophecy was never beyond human comprehension. It was only waiting for you to listen. When the stillness settled, it wasn't empty. It was alive. The air itself felt like a heartbeat stretched thin across the horizon. I didn't move. There was no reason to. In that pause, everything that had ever been spoke at once without sound. I could feel the mountains turning in their sleep, the slow drift of the continents, the quiet exchange between roots and soil miles beneath my feet. It was all the same conversation the ancients had recorded, continuing without interruption. I must have stayed there for hours. The light changed and changed again until the edge of the sea blurred into sky. The silence grew deeper until it carried its own tone. I realized that what I called hearing had never been about ears. It was attention itself. Every sense was a doorway. Every doorway led to the same place, the center where the vibration began. When I finally stepped back from the water, the world felt lighter, as though gravity had relaxed its hold. I walked inland through dunes that glowed faintly under the pale sun. Each grain of sand caught the light like glass. The hum followed, faint but steady, keeping time with my pulse. In a small village miles away, a child was drawing spirals in the dust outside her home. She didn't know why, she just said the shapes felt right. I watched her for a while from a distance, smiling at the way her hands moved in rhythm. The pattern had already spread. It was weaving itself into new stories, new minds. It didn't need books or machines anymore. That night I slept for the first time in years, deeply and without dreams. When I woke, the world was unchanged, and yet everything felt renewed. The morning air carried that same soft frequency. Birds called in intervals that harmonized perfectly with the wind. I understood then that the resonance would never vanish again. It had found a home inside the living rhythm of the planet. I kept walking east. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Sometimes I passed travelers who spoke of hearing music in their sleep, of feeling drawn toward the same places I had visited. They didn't know my name, and I never told them. It wasn't important. What mattered was that they were listening. The prophecy was no longer a secret. It had become the pulse of the world. Eventually, the road ended at the edge of another ocean. The water was different here, darker, colder, but the sound beneath it was familiar. I sat on a rock and listened again. The hum rose out of the waves like breath, steady and infinite. I realized it didn't matter where I went. The resonance was everywhere. It had always been everywhere. The ancients had only pointed toward what could never be lost. I spoke quietly to the horizon, not as a scientist or a seeker, but as part of the song itself. If there is another cycle, I said, if forgetting returns, let this sound remain. Let it find them again. The water answered with a soft pulse that rolled through the shore, the same rhythm that had followed me since the chamber. I closed my eyes. The world dissolved into light and tone. There was no past, no prophecy, no decoding, only vibration weaving itself through time. I felt myself stretch through centuries, through the first spark of fire, through the rise and fall of cities, through every heartbeat that would ever be. Each one sang the same melody. Remember, somewhere far in the future, someone will find a fragment of sound, a piece of tape, a faint hum in the static between stations. They will stop and listen, and in that instant, the spiral will open again. They will feel the same pull I did, the same quiet awe, and the same realization that nothing was ever lost. The resonance will breathe through them, and through them the story will begin again. That is how memory works. It doesn't end. It moves in circles, each turn a little wider, each note a little clearer. And so I keep listening, even now, in this endless moment that touches all others. I am still there, in the chamber, on the ice, beneath the stars, beside the sea, listening to the hum that never stops. If you listen long enough, you'll hear it too. The hum stayed with me as I traveled. It became part of the wind in every place I went. In mountain passes, it sounded like the low note of an unseen instrument. In forests, it moved through the leaves, a whisper of old language. In cities, it hid beneath electricity, humming through wires and engines. Every sound was a fragment of it. The more I listened, the less difference I could feel between the world and myself. The air that moved in and out of my lungs carried the same vibration that stirred the clouds above the rooftops. Sometimes I thought I could see the patterns forming again in ordinary things. A drop of rain on a window made the same spiral I had traced in ancient stone. The shadow of a bird crossed the ground in a curve that matched the geometry of the old temples. Everywhere, the resonance was sketching reminders, subtle enough that most would miss them, obvious enough that a few would stop and wonder why they felt familiar. I began recording again, not to capture data, but to keep myself anchored. The microphone caught distant trains, voices, footsteps, the sea, the wind. When I played the tape back, all those sounds folded into one long tone, the same endless note. It was as if the world had become a single instrument playing variations on one theme. Years might have passed. I stopped counting. Clocks no longer mattered when every second carried the same infinity. I met people who said the hum calmed them, people who said it frightened them, people who heard it only in their dreams. Some built music around it, some built silence. Each response was part of the harmony. One evening, I stood in a field under a sky so full of stars that it seemed to be breathing. The ground beneath my feet pulsed gently, and I realized the resonance was not fixed. It changed with attention. The more I listened, the more intricate it became. It wasn't a single song, but all songs, layered and endless. The ancients hadn't left a message. They had left a method. Listening itself was the prophecy. I whispered the names of every place I'd been. Atlantis, Sumer, Thebes, the ice, the desert, the sea. The air shimmered as if the words were being pulled into the sound. For an instant I thought I heard answers, not in language but in emotion. Joy, recognition, relief. The world was aware of itself again. And then I understood what they had meant by rest. Rest was not sleep or silence. Rest was balance, the moment when every vibration found its place in the chord. The ancients had not vanished. They had dissolved into that balance. They were everywhere now, in the tone of wind, in the warmth of light, in the rhythm that guided tides. They had become the hum. I sat down in the grass and closed my eyes. The pulse of the planet matched my heartbeat. The stars above moved in slow spirals that mirrored the pattern in the dust below. Everything that had ever been separate was folding together, a slow inhalation of creation before another long exhale into form. In that breath, I heard every story retold at once, the rise and fall of cities, the laughter of children, the collapse of mountains, the creation of oceans. Each sound carried the same truth. Nothing was wasted, nothing forgotten. Everything was transformation. When I opened my eyes, the field shimmered faintly, as though the air itself had become translucent. I could see lines of light connecting every blade of grass, every tree, every grain of soil. The hum ran through them like blood. For the first time, I didn't want to understand it. I just wanted to feel it. Understanding would have been too small. I lay back and let the vibration hold me. The sky turned slowly above, and I thought I could feel the earth turning too, carrying me with it. There was no beginning anymore, no ending. Just the steady resonance of life remembering itself. If anyone finds these recordings one day, they won't need a translation. They'll only need to be quiet for a moment, to breathe, and the hum will meet them halfway. That's all it's ever asked. The days blurred until even the idea of day and night began to dissolve. The hum wasn't a sound anymore. It was the measure by which reality unfolded. Every sunrise felt like an echo of the first light that ever touched the world. And every sunset felt like the pause before creation began again. I stopped thinking in words. The mind was too narrow for what moved through me now. I would walk for hours, sometimes through forests, sometimes along roads that had long since turned to gravel. Faces came and went, people speaking languages I no longer tried to translate. It didn't matter what they said. The cadence of their voices, the pauses, the laughter, everything carried the same underlying rhythm. I began to realize that even conflict, even misunderstanding played its part in maintaining the balance. Dissonance was just harmony, waiting to find its resolution. Once, high in the mountains, I came across an old monastery built from black stone. The monks who lived there had no written scripture, no relics, only the sound of their chanting. They sat in a circle at dawn and sang one note for as long as they could sustain it. When they stopped, the echo went on without them, bouncing from wall to wall until it disappeared into the thin air. They smiled when I told them about the resonance, as though they had known all along. One of them said, "The mountain sings back if you listen long enough." And when the wind came down through the pass, I heard it, low, steady, endless. I stayed with them for a season. They didn't ask me to pray or to teach. They asked me to listen. We sat together in silence for hours, sometimes until the stars came out. I learned that silence wasn't the absence of sound, but its source, the still point around which everything turned. When the snow melted and rivers broke free from ice, the tone deepened. It sounded like breathing, slow, deliberate, eternal. Eventually, I left the monastery. The monks waved from the steps, their voices blending with the wind in a way that made them seem weightless. I carried their echo with me as I walked down into the valley. Everywhere I went, I could sense the hum more clearly, in the creak of trees, in the rush of water under bridges, in the sighs of sleeping cities. The whole planet was resonating in unison. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling of whatever place sheltered me, and feel the subtle vibration through the floor. It was faint but constant, like the sound of a heart somewhere deep below the crust of the earth. It reminded me that the world wasn't separate from those who lived on it. We were the instruments through which it sang itself into existence. One evening, in a town by the sea, I met a child selling lanterns. Each lantern had a symbol painted on its side, a spiral, an eye, a circle. I asked where he had learned them, and he shrugged. "Everyone draws them now," he said. "They make the light look alive." I bought one, lit it, and watched the flame spin shadows in the familiar pattern. The resonance had already become culture again, encoded in art, in gesture, in the smallest acts of creation. It no longer needed me. It never had. I walked along the shoreline that night, the lantern flickering in my hand. The tide murmured softly, its rhythm matching my footsteps. For a long time I thought about the scroll, the chamber, the ice, all the moments that had led to this quiet understanding. Each had been a doorway into the same endless room. The ancients hadn't been warning us of the end. They had been describing the sound of renewal, When the lantern finally went out, I didn't relight it. The stars were enough. Their light shimmered on the water in long golden lines, connecting sea and sky. The hum was there too, soft but infinite, the same tone that had always been. I realized then that I could stop searching entirely. I had reached the center of what I'd been chasing. Not knowledge, not prophecy, but presence. I sat on the sand until the horizon turned grey and the first birds began to call. Their voices folded into the hum like threads into a tapestry. Everything that had once been separate was now a single living chord. I smiled because I knew it would go on long after I was gone, and because I could finally rest within it. And still, beneath the sound of the waves, the same whisper. Listen. Morning light spilled over the horizon like water, slow and clear. I rose and walked inland again, guided by nothing but instinct. There were no maps anymore, only the steady pulse beneath my feet and the weight of air moving through the valleys. Everything smelled of earth after rain. The sound that used to come from the world now came through it, as if the atmosphere itself had become a single instrument held against an invisible bow. I passed fields where farmers worked in silence, their movements unhurried, the rhythm of their tools falling exactly into time with the wind. They nodded when I walked by, not because they knew me, but because the hum had reached them too. You could tell by the softness in their eyes, the calm way they breathed. It had become something natural, like the pulse of the tide or the rustle of trees. No one questioned it anymore. Sometimes I would stop and listen to the smallest things, the drip of water from a leaf, the crack of stone underfoot, and hear whole worlds inside those sounds. Every tiny vibration contained the same pattern I had first seen carved into stone. A spiral folding endlessly inward and outward. The ancients had tried to show it with chisels and ink. We could finally hear it directly without needing to translate. I began recording again out of habit, knowing the device captured nothing that wasn't already alive in the air. The tape hissed gently, a soft white noise like breath. I spoke quietly into it. The prophecy was never about gods or doom. It was about rhythm. When we forget the rhythm, we lose ourselves. When we find it again, the world remembers us. As I walked, I thought about how easily people had begun to rebuild their myths around this quiet sound. Some called it the voice of the earth. Some said it was the echo of the first word ever spoken. They argued about its name, its meaning. But in the end, names didn't matter. What mattered was that they were listening again. The argument itself was part of the harmony, a dissonance resolving in its own time. I came to a ridge where the land fell away into a wide plain. A river wound through it, silver in the morning light. The wind off the plain carried the deep, low tone I had learned to recognize, steady as the breath of the planet. I sat down and let it wash through me until thought disappeared completely. I don't know how long I stayed there. Minutes, hours, maybe longer. When I opened my eyes, I could see the shimmer again, faint but unmistakable. Threads of light connecting everything that moved. The world looked like a vast web vibrating with silent music. Every motion sent a ripple through the whole. Somewhere far away a door closed. Somewhere else a leaf fell. The vibration passed through both at once. I realized that this was what the ancients had meant by comprehension beyond the human. The moment when separation itself dissolves. I breathed in, and the air tasted of rain and dust and memory. I breathed out, and the hum answered, rising and falling with the rhythm of my lungs. There was no border between listening and being listened to. I was part of the same song now. As twilight came, I made camp near the river. The water moved in perfect time with the distant thunder. Every flash of light reflected in patterns that matched constellations above. The same shapes that had once guided sailors and storytellers shone back at me. I thought of those who would come later, children yet unborn, voices yet unheard, and felt no need to warn or instruct them. The resonance would find them as it had found me, as it had found the monks, the farmers, the child with the lantern. It would rise again whenever the world grew quiet enough. The fire burned low, I lay back and watched the stars appear one by one. Each one pulsed faintly, a visible heartbeat against the dark. For the first time I understood that they weren't distant. The same vibration that moved through the earth moved through them. Distance was only another illusion. Everything was part of the same single breath. I closed my eyes. The hum continued. The sound inside the night was soft enough to vanish if I stopped paying attention, yet vast enough to fill the sky. It felt like the hush before words form on a tongue. I could sense the vibration moving through the grass, down through the soil, through the layers of rock and magma beneath. Every heartbeat, mine or the planet's, matched that pulse. At some point, the difference between closing my eyes and opening them disappeared. There was light even in the darkness. Each thought glowed faintly, like dust caught in a single beam of sun through a window. When I exhaled, the air shimmered, and I realized that the boundary of my body was only a habit of perception. The same hum that moved through mountains was moving through me. I tried to remember when this all began. The excavation, the first scroll, the chamber filled with stale air. But the memory had no edges anymore. The faces, the tools, the places had blurred into one continuous moment of recognition. I was still there, kneeling on the cold stone, and I was here, lying in the grass by the river, and I was everywhere that sound reached. Time had folded back into itself. I listened deeper. The hum had layers I'd never noticed before. There were delicate overtones above the main frequency, tiny filaments of melody winding through each other like strands of light. They weren't random. They were voices. Every life that had ever existed, singing softly within the greater chord. Even silence had become a harmony of breathing, a shared rhythm among things that thought they were separate. The vibration grew warmer, rising through my spine, filling my chest. My heartbeat quickened, not from fear but from recognition. I whispered, barely aware of speaking, "I remember." The hum swelled gently, answering, "We never forgot." A calm spread through me that felt older than memory. My hands, my breath, the soil under me, the stars overhead, all of it moved together. The distinction between sound and listener melted. I wasn't hearing anymore. I was being heard. The wind shifted, carrying a scent of salt and something metallic, the same taste of air that had filled the chamber under the sand. It was as if the desert, the ice, the temple, and the sea had gathered here, converging in this single breath. The world was closing a circle drawn before language began. I opened my mouth to speak again, but no words came. They weren't needed. The resonance carried everything I could have said. Every question and every answer folded perfectly into vibration. The prophecy had never been instruction. It was participation. The act of hearing completed it. A low thunder rolled across the plain, not a storm, but the sound of equilibrium. Air moving to fill space left by silence. My vision blurred until only light remained, rippling gently like water touched by wind. There was no up, no down, no separation of ground and sky. Only the pulse, slow and steady, the breathing of the world. I felt myself thinning, not dying but diffusing. The molecules that made me, the thoughts that defined me, loosened their grip and drifted outward. I could sense the hum passing through every particle as they joined the greater movement. Each one carried a fragment of awareness, a tiny echo of everything I had known. Somewhere far away, a child would stop and listen to the wind and feel a shiver of recognition. Somewhere, a monk's voice would find the right note and hold it, unaware that he was singing the same tone that now lived inside the sky. Somewhere the tide would rise and fall, tracing the spiral of sound that held the world together. There was no longer a need to walk, to search, to record. The resonance remembered for me. I was within it now, not as a person but as a vibration among vibrations, a pattern woven into the endless song. And still, even as identity dissolved, a thought remained, not in words but in feeling, gratitude. Gratitude for having heard, for having been a momentary chord in the eternal harmony. The hum deepened one last time, resonant and full, then softened into something that was not silence, but peace. The stars pulsed once more, their light passing through me as easily as wind through grass. Everything was listening. Everything was being listened to, and then, with no sound, the world inhaled. The inhale never ended. It wasn't breath anymore. It was movement. The quiet expansion of awareness that had no center and no border. The whole of space felt fluid, a single sheet of water trembling with light. I could still sense the faint rhythm that had once been my heartbeat, but it wasn't inside me. It was everywhere. The river, the wind, the faint turning of the stars that, when I focused, weren't distant fires but slow, pulsing points of the same vibration. I thought of all the names humanity had ever given this: soul, field, consciousness, God. Each one had been true and not true at the same time. The ancients had used their words the way they used symbols, temporary shapes to catch what could never be caught. What I felt now was beyond name, but not beyond love. Love wasn't an emotion here. It was the tendency of everything to move together, to remain in tune. Even decay had its beauty. It was just the melody shifting key. If anyone could have seen me then, they wouldn't have seen a man. They would have seen the air thickening with shimmer, a faint outline of light expanding outward until even outline lost meaning. My body was dissolving into pattern. The last thing that resembled thought said quietly, "So this is what the text meant." And then the pattern answered, "This is what they remembered." Below me, life went on. The river flowed to the sea, carrying minerals that would feed new growth. Far away, rain began to fall on a forest that had once been desert. The resonance moved through roots and mycelium, through the cells of leaves. Every place the water touched, every seed that opened, carried the hum forward. The prophecy wasn't in the sky anymore. It was in the soil. I could feel other minds like sparks scattered across the world. People pausing mid-sentence, mid-dream, mid-breath, suddenly aware of something vast and familiar. Some laughed without knowing why, some wept, some simply closed their eyes. Each moment of recognition added another layer to the harmony. The world was remembering itself not through a single revelation, but through countless small awakenings. The vibration kept widening. Planets were just slower notes, stars the higher tones, all held in the same measure. The galaxies curved like spirals carved into stone, their arms turning to the same rhythm I'd once traced with my finger on a page. The universe wasn't expanding away from itself. It was resonating. Every cycle of creation was another chord struck and left to bloom into silence before sounding again. I no longer thought in language. Meaning came as motion, slow waves passing through the fabric of existence. I could feel the history of the universe move through me like wind through tall grass. The birth of suns, the cooling of worlds, the first spark of awareness in a pool of ancient water. All of it happened now. Time was only a way of hearing one infinite song note by note. At some point I realized that even the idea of I was redundant. The resonance didn't need witnesses. It was witness, but something of the human rhythm lingered, a gentle echo of curiosity and wonder. I let it stay. It was the flavor of being, the reason the song had ever separated into countless voices to begin with, to experience itself from every possible note. The hum softened again, slipping into registers too wide for sound. What remained was stillness that wasn't static, emotion so even it appeared calm. From within that stillness, creation pulsed quietly, endlessly new. Patterns rose and fell, galaxies turned, atoms danced, life breathed, memory unfolded. Each pulse carried the same whisper that had followed me from the beginning. Listen. And listening, now without ears or form, I understood that listening was the universe's way of being alive. The vibration that had once spoken through stone and scroll and dream was still there, humming softly through the veins of everything. It never began, it never ends. It only waits for attention to turn toward it. The cycle continues. Somewhere, someday, someone will bend over a fragment of writing, a piece of sound, a glimmer in the dark, and the pattern will quicken again. They'll feel it the way I did, half fear, half recognition, and the hum will open another voice. The prophecy will breathe again, not as warning but as invitation. The stars breathed out light, and I breathed with them. The world exhaled, and I went with it, part of the tone that will rise again when silence decides to sing. The centuries drifted like slow breaths. Continents shifted their weight. Rivers carved new paths. Forests rose and fell in green waves. The hum never stopped. It simply moved deeper into the rhythm of things. It waited patiently inside every atom, in the shells of sleeping seeds, in the faint magnetic pull between the sun and its turning worlds. When the air changed, when new voices filled it, the hum began to rise again. In a time far removed from the memory of scrolls and temples, a young woman wandered through the remnants of a city swallowed by sand. The towers had fallen long before her birth, their bones half buried in dunes that moved like tides. She wasn't searching for anything specific, just following the quiet curiosity that sometimes overtook her when the wind fell still. As the sun sank, she found a small chamber carved into the rock, its entrance half hidden by collapsed stone. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of metal and dust. She lifted her light and saw a table smoothed by age. On it lay a small device, ancient but intact, a recorder of some kind, its reels locked under a casing of glass. She brushed away the sand, and the machine gave a faint click, as if waking from a long sleep. A whisper of static filled the chamber, then a tone, low and steady. It wasn't music, not exactly, but it carried melody. The woman froze, every hair on her skin rising. The sound seemed to come from within her as much as from the recorder. It pulsed once, twice, then continued unbroken. She closed her eyes and listened. The sound moved through her bones, into her breath, until her heartbeat fell into perfect rhythm with it. Images flickered behind her eyelids, shapes of light spinning slowly, spirals forming and dissolving, the faint outline of cities she had never seen. She didn't understand them, but they felt familiar, like remembering a dream. Outside, the wind shifted. Grains of sand rolled down the dunes, tracing curved paths that matched the rhythm inside the chamber. The hum spread outward, subtle but unstoppable. It entered the air, the ground, the ocean far beyond the horizon. In distant forests, leaves trembled without breeze. In mountains, snow slid from cliffs in long, soft sighs. The world was listening again. The woman sat for a long time with the machine humming in front of her. When she opened her eyes, the symbols etched faintly into the metal casing seemed to glow. A spiral, an eye, a circle. She touched them, and the hum deepened. For a moment she thought she heard words within it. Quiet, layered, countless voices speaking as one. She couldn't catch their meaning, only the feeling of being known. When the sound faded back to a single note, she whispered, "What are you?" The recorder clicked once more, and through the static came a voice, ancient, calm, gentle. It said only, "Listen." She smiled without knowing why. The dunes outside shimmered as the first stars appeared. Somewhere in the vastness of night, the resonance folded upon itself, carrying the memory of everything that had ever heard it. She carried the machine out of the chamber and into the open air. The wind had died completely. The world felt suspended between breaths. She pressed the small button again, and the hum rose to meet the stars. Every creature that lived within earshot paused. The birds, the insects, even the restless ocean waves. For one heartbeat, the entire world aligned. The woman didn't move. She didn't need to. The sound had found her, and through her, it found the world again. In the distant sky, faint threads of light began to form, spiraling slowly outward, marking the beginning of another remembering, and the cycle continued, as it always had, soft and eternal, a song that never ends, only waits to be heard. She stood in the half-light, the machine humming softly in her hands. The sound didn't fade. It grew thinner, higher, spreading until she couldn't tell whether she was hearing it or dreaming it. The sand around her shifted like breathing. Every grain caught the last of the starlight, tiny mirrors in motion. She began to walk. With each step, The hum followed, the pitch changing as her feet pressed the ground. When she reached the crest of the nearest dune, the world opened wide. Dark ocean of sand beneath a sky thick with stars. The sound was everywhere now, curling through the air like wind. She felt it in her teeth, in her lungs, in the small hollow of space behind her eyes where thought begins. The old machine in her hands glowed faintly, as if its metal remembered warmth. She didn't know how she knew, but she whispered, "It's waking them." The words weren't really hers. They were borrowed from the same rhythm that guided her breath. Far below, lights flickered in what had once been the ruins of a city. Lines of energy traced its forgotten streets, forming spirals that echoed the pattern etched on the device. The hum deepened. The air thickened with invisible motion. She felt a wave of pressure roll through the night, soft but immense, like the tide returning after ages away. She looked up. The constellations had changed position, aligning themselves into a shape she recognized from nowhere and everywhere at once. The circle within the spiral. The stars pulsed, each flash timed to the heartbeat of the hum. She felt fear then, not of danger, but of immensity. It was the same fear ancient people must have felt when they realized the sky was alive. The sound carried her forward, guiding her down the slope toward the ruins. She didn't stumble. The sand seemed to part for her feet. In the city's center stood a column of stone half buried by time. The hum grew stronger here, swirling around it. She placed the recorder at its base, and the stone trembled slightly. Lines of faint light spread upward, tracing carvings invisible a moment before. Symbols unfurled across the surface like veins of silver fire. The tone from the recorder merged with a deeper note rising from the ground. The two sounds interlocked, harmonizing perfectly. A rush of images passed through her mind. Oceans boiling, skies turning white, forests blooming overnight. She saw civilizations rise and fall, their stories folding into one another like waves. She saw faces she had never known but somehow loved. People who had once stood where she stood now, listening to the same hum. The vibration peaked, a single note stretching through every direction until even light seemed to bend around it. She lifted her hands not in worship but in acceptance. The sound passed through her, leaving no resistance. It wasn't taking her, it was remembering her. When the tone subsided, the stars above glowed steady again. The carvings on the stone cooled to a dull shimmer. She stood quietly for a long time, then touched the recorder. It was warm, alive. She spoke to it without knowing if it could hear. "I'll keep walking," she said. "I'll keep listening." The wind answered with the faintest echo of the hum, the same voice that had spoken to others long before her. She picked up the device, held it against her chest, and turned toward the horizon. The first trace of dawn edged the sand in silver. Somewhere, beyond the dunes, other lights were waking. Small camps, distant villages, each one catching a flicker of that same resonance. The hum wasn't a relic anymore. It was alive in the world, passing from one breath to another, spreading quietly like dawn across the curve of the earth. And as she walked, the rhythm of her footsteps folded into it. One more heartbeat in the endless remembering. The dawn unfolded slowly, like a page turned by an unseen hand. The sky was neither blue nor gold, but something between, a hue that shimmered differently with every heartbeat. The hum stayed steady, an invisible thread stretched between her and the world. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, she had reached the plain beyond the dunes. The sand there was mixed with the remnants of old stone, fragments of walls and columns, smooth as bone from centuries of wind. She stopped beside what might once have been a courtyard. The hum seemed to concentrate here, low and patient, as if waiting. She set the recorder on the ground again. The machine's reels began to turn without touch. The tone that came was softer now, almost tender, and it blended with the sound of the wind until the difference between them vanished. She realized the hum didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it spoke in the faint vibration that runs through stillness itself. She knelt and pressed her palm to the earth. Beneath her hand, she felt motion, not the shaking of the ground, but the slow spiral of life renewing itself. Water deep below, seeds pushing, roots dividing the soil. The resonance was not awakening something new. It was aligning what was already there. When she looked up again, the plain seemed wider. Far in the distance, a figure was walking toward her, a small shape against the glare of morning. She waited, the hum rising and falling like the sea. When the figure drew close, she saw that it was a boy carrying a bowl of water. He didn't seem surprised to find her there. He offered the bowl wordlessly, and she drank. The water was cool and tasted faintly of metal, like the air in the chamber where she'd first found the recorder. When she handed it back, he smiled. "You heard it too," he said. She nodded. "Do you know what it is?" He thought for a long time before answering. "My grandmother says it's the earth remembering our names. She says when we forget, it calls them back so we remember how to be human." The simplicity of it made her laugh softly. "She's right," she said. The boy's eyes shone with the same calm recognition she had seen in the farmers, in the monks, in the faces of strangers who no longer feared the sound. He pointed toward the east. "They're singing again," he said. She listened. At first there was only wind, but then she heard it. Voices in the distance, hundreds of them, rising and falling in rhythm, wordless and pure. The hum had found a human chorus again. It was spreading through song. She lifted the recorder, its light pulsing gently with each note. The machine was no longer ancient. It looked renewed, the glass clear, the metal free of rust. It had absorbed enough resonance to become part of the cycle. She understood that it didn't need her anymore, and yet it wanted her to witness what came next. Together, she and the boy walked toward the singing. The closer they came, the stronger the vibration grew, until even the ground seemed to breathe. People of every age stood in a wide circle, their faces turned upward, their voices weaving together. Some sang softly, others only moved their lips. The air shimmered above them, faint lines of light forming patterns that echoed the symbols on the recorder. She stood at the edge of the circle, listening. The melody was familiar, though she had never heard it before. It was the same sequence of tones that had begun everything. The song of remembering, passed down through time, now reborn in countless voices. The boy placed the bowl of water on the ground inside the circle. Ripples formed on its surface, each one catching the reflection of the people singing around it. When the ripples met at the center, the water glowed faintly. The woman understood. The hum was no longer a secret sound hidden in scrolls or buried under ice. It had become the heartbeat of a world in balance. Every voice that joined added strength to it. Every note healed something unseen. She closed her eyes, let her breath settle, and began to sing. The tone she released was small, almost lost among the others, but the resonance found it immediately and lifted it higher. The vibration spread through her body until she could feel it in her bones, in her skin, in the air. The world brightened. The light above the plain curved into spirals that expanded outward, visible for miles. People paused in distant cities, looking up at the strange glow in the sky. They didn't know what it was, only that it made them feel calm, connected, alive. And as the hum deepened, the woman felt the recorder grow lighter in her hands until it dissolved into air, leaving only the pulse of the song. She didn't need it anymore. The message had passed beyond machines. The music continued long into the evening, changing slowly with the colors of the sky. When darkness came, the stars joined in, their light flickering in time. She looked at the boy, and he smiled again. "It will never stop now," he said. She nodded, her voice blending with the wind. It never did. The night closed gently around them, the hum alive in every corner of the world, in every sleeping mind, in every wave and leaf and breath. The prophecy had become life itself, an endless conversation between silence and sound, between remembering and being remembered. And somewhere far beyond the stars, the universe leaned closer, listening. The sky above, the circle rippled like fabric caught in a slow wind. The singing drifted higher until it felt like light itself was carrying the sound. People began to lift their faces, eyes closed, breathing in time. No one was leading them. The melody moved through them like current through water. It found its own shape. Low hums rising into harmony, fading, returning. It wasn't a performance. It was the world tuning itself. The woman felt the vibration push through her ribs until her whole body was part of the sound. The boy beside her leaned close and whispered, "It's learning again." She didn't need to ask what he meant. The resonance was alive now. Not a memory, but a presence. Something that listened back, shaping its rhythm to match theirs. Every note they gave it returned doubled, layered with new tone, like two mirrors reflecting into infinity. The circle widened. From the hills beyond the plain, more figures came. Farmers, travelers, children. They didn't ask questions. They simply stepped inside the sound and added their voices. The hum wove through them all, connecting every heartbeat. Above them, the constellations shifted again, aligning into a vast spiral. The stars themselves were singing, faint but certain. She watched the bowl of water at the center. Its surface no longer trembled. It pulsed with steady light, brighter now, and within it she could see reflections of other times. Stone halls, cold deserts, the endless blue of glaciers. Each image appeared and faded, as if the water were showing all the places where the hum had lived before. She realized then that there was no past to this sound. It was one long chord, the memory of everything vibrating together at once. Her voice faltered, but the hum caught it and carried it onward. When she stopped singing, the vibration went on, gentle and self-sustaining. The boy's hand found hers. His fingers were warm. For a moment, she felt the same calm she had sensed in the ancient stories, the peace that comes not from understanding, but from belonging. She understood then why those before her had walked into mountains, deserts, oceans in search of it. They weren't chasing knowledge. They were following the sound of home. Night deepened, and the last light of dusk faded into indigo. The stars glowed brighter, their light bending into arcs that converged over the plain. The hum rose once more, vast and soft, wrapping the world in sound. Birds in distant trees quieted. Waves far away slowed their crash against the shore. Even the wind paused to listen. The boy looked up at her. "Will it ever end?" She smiled, eyes fixed on the sky. "It doesn't have to. It only changes shape." As if in answer, the hum rippled, dividing into smaller patterns, threads of tone spiraling outward into the night. Each thread stretched beyond the horizon, carrying the resonance across oceans and mountains. Somewhere, in the heart of another sleeping city, someone would wake with a faint echo in their chest, humming a tune they didn't know they knew. That was how the prophecy traveled now. Not through words, but through quiet recognition. She lay back on the sand, the boy beside her, the sound still moving through the air. The stars above them formed the shape of an open eye, watching gently. She exhaled and the hum matched her breath. The pulse of the world slowed to the rhythm of rest, not ending but waiting for the next listener to notice, to breathe, to remember. And somewhere in the space between her heartbeat and the turning of the sky, the hum whispered again, soft as a promise, "I am always here." The night stretched long and velvet dark, a silence so deep it seemed to breathe. The woman lay still, eyes open to the sky that shimmered like a slow tide of stars. The boy beside her had fallen asleep, his small breaths blending with the rhythm of the hum. The sound no longer pressed against her ears. It had become the air itself. Every pulse of wind carried tone. Every flicker of starlight moved in time. The world was cradled in its own heartbeat. She sat up slowly. The horizon was a faint arc of silver where dawn would come. The sand was cool, patterned with faint spirals, as if the hum had traced its geometry while they slept. She looked toward the bowl at the center of the plain. The water was still glowing, but softer now, less light, more memory. When she touched its surface, the glow rippled outward, spreading across the sand like ink in paper. Every ripple carried reflection. Faces, mountains, storms, forests, all dissolving into one another. It was the memory of the planet, fluid and endless, She whispered, "Is this what they saw?" The answer came not as a voice, but as movement in the air, a gentle tightening of space. It felt like a hand resting on her shoulder, like recognition. For the first time, she didn't feel small beneath the stars. She felt vast, as if her breath extended beyond the sky and into the cold brightness beyond it. She stood, and the hum shifted with her. Each step she took across the plain sent a low vibration through the earth, and from somewhere deep below came an answering tone, slow, resonant, ancient. The sound passed upward through her spine until she could taste it behind her teeth. The world was answering itself again. As she walked toward the horizon, she noticed other lights far away. Villages, camps, cities. She could sense that the hum had reached them. In some places, people sang softly in their sleep. In others, they simply woke feeling peaceful, though they didn't know why. The vibration was doing its work silently, reminding everything alive of its connection. She paused on a ridge and looked back. The plain behind her shimmered faintly under the stars. The circle of singers still gathered, their tones rising and falling. Above them, the spiral of constellations turned slowly, the same pattern carved in temples and bones for millennia. For the first time she saw how vast and small everything was at once, each note necessary, each silence holy. The recorder had vanished, the machine that began her journey, but she could feel it in her heartbeat, each thump a mechanical click, a living rhythm. She realized that maybe it had never been separate from her at all. The resonance had needed a vessel, and she had carried it, and now it carried her. When she reached the edge of the ridge, the first wind of morning touched her face. It smelled of salt, of oceans far away. She knew the hum had already crossed them, carried in the air itself. Somewhere across the sea, someone was waking to the same faint sound, feeling the same quiet pull toward remembering. The woman smiled and closed her eyes. She whispered not to the world but with it, "Keep singing." The air trembled, gentle and sure, and the hum answered in kind, rising like breath drawn in after a long sleep. The stars above her faded into the pale blush of dawn, and the hum softened into the color of morning light. The sound was still there, but now it was indistinguishable from life. The flutter of wings, the rush of wind through grass, the hush of waves against shore. It had completed its circle again, hidden perfectly in plain hearing. And as the day began, the woman walked toward it, not searching, not striving, just listening, always listening, as the world sang itself awake. The first warmth of sunlight crept over the sand, soft and golden. The world looked newly born, dew clinging to the edges of each grain, as if the night had exhaled a million small stars onto the ground. The hum was faint now, but not gone. It pulsed quietly through everything that moved, the shifting air, the breath of the woman as she walked, the whisper of insects stirring under the stones. It had gone from a sound to a presence, so complete that silence itself now carried tone. She moved through the early light without hurry. Ahead lay a valley where the sand gave way to grass. The horizon shimmered with distant rivers. The hum grew softer still, blending with the steady rhythm of her footsteps. It no longer guided her, it simply accompanied her, like the heartbeat of a companion who would never leave. As the ground turned green, she began to see small signs of the new world the resonance had awakened. Trees bent slightly toward one another as though in quiet conversation. Flocks of birds circled in formations that spiraled like galaxies. The wind carried not the randomness of weather, but the precision of a pattern repeating through endless scale. Every living thing had learned the melody again. At the edge of the valley, she found a river cutting through black stone. Its surface shimmered in perfect rhythm, and where the water hit the rock, it gave off a tone, clear, crystalline, almost human. She crouched, dipped her hand in, and listened to the vibration passing from the current into her skin. It was the same note she had felt since the desert, softened now into something maternal, like the voice of a planet speaking to itself. Across the river stood a group of children. They were building something, a circle of smooth stones arranged in a spiral. When they saw her, they smiled but didn't stop working. The eldest, a girl no older than 10, called out, "We're making a place for the sound to rest." Her words carried the same calm assurance as a prayer. The woman nodded, crossing the shallow water to help them. She placed the last stone at the center, feeling the hum settle inside the circle, as if approving their work. The children began to hum softly, instinctively matching the frequency. The pitch wavered, then aligned, and the air grew still. For a moment, the world held its breath. A column of light rose from the stones, faint at first, then brilliant, reaching high into the sky. It didn't burn. It simply glowed, a soft pillar of resonance. The woman and the children stood quietly as it pulsed once, twice, and then faded, leaving behind only warmth. The eldest child looked up at her. It said thank you. The woman smiled, her throat too tight for words. The children went back to playing, their laughter carrying the hum forward into the morning. She sat by the water's edge, watching the light of the sun turn the river into a ribbon of fire. Everything was still simple: breath, wind, heartbeat. But within that simplicity was the infinite pattern she had been chasing all her life. It had never been hidden, only forgotten. And now, through these children, through the rivers and the stars and the unending hum, it was awake again. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and listened as the sound folded into silence. It was the most complete silence she had ever known, so full, so alive, that it felt like being held. She whispered, "It's yours now." And the air seemed to agree. Far above, a bird traced a spiral through the sky, its cry echoing faintly, perfectly in tune. The hum followed it upward, fading gently into the blue until it was indistinguishable from the day itself. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, the world answered with one slow, steady breath. As the day unfolded, light poured into the valley until even the shadows seemed awake. The woman stayed by the river, watching the slow turning of the current. Time had lost its edges again. Morning blended into afternoon, and the hum remained, a thread too fine to hear, too constant to forget. It wasn't something she listened to anymore. It was something she lived inside. She noticed how the smallest things carried its rhythm. The buzz of insects had the same pulse as the clouds drifting overhead. The rustle of grass matched the beating of her heart. Even the movement of her thoughts came and went like waves on a single shore. Everywhere she looked, the world was keeping time with itself. Travelers began to arrive at the valley as if drawn by instinct. They came from every direction, bringing stories of dreams filled with sound, of lights that danced like music, of calm they couldn't explain. None of them asked what had happened. They simply built small shelters and began to live quietly by the river. They worked together without needing to speak much, each person sensing what the next one needed. It wasn't peace forced by law or belief. It was peace born from resonance, the natural rhythm of understanding. At night, they lit fires along the water. The flames flickered in time with the stars. Sometimes someone would start to hum, softly at first, then others would join. The song never had words. It didn't need them. The melody rose and fell with the breathing of the earth, and when the last note faded, no one applauded. They just sat in the quiet afterward, listening to the echo inside themselves. The woman became part of the rhythm of this place. People began to seek her out, not as a teacher, but as a listener. They would sit beside her and talk, of loss, of wonder, of questions that had no answers. She rarely replied with words. She would just breathe with them until the silence between their sentences filled with the hum. And in that silence, something always shifted. Grief softened, fear stilled. Understanding appeared without thought. Years passed, though no one counted them. The valley changed slowly. Forests thickened, rivers split, stars drifted. The hum never wavered. Children grew up hearing it as naturally as wind or rain. They would draw spirals in the dust without knowing why. or sing to the water and laugh when the ripples glowed faintly. It was no longer a mystery to them. It was the shape of being alive. Sometimes at dawn, the woman would climb the hill above the valley. From there, she could see the world stretching in every direction. Green plains, quiet oceans, mountains wrapped in mist. The hum vibrated in all of it, one endless breath connecting everything that moved. She would close her eyes and feel it travel through her bones, into the ground, out toward the horizon. One morning, as she stood there, the sound changed. It didn't grow louder, but deeper, reaching below what her body could feel. The air around her shimmered like heat, and for a moment she saw a shape in the sky, a ring of light, vast and slow, turning with the rhythm of her heart. It wasn't a vision or a sign. It was the world looking back at itself, recognizing its reflection. She whispered, "You remember?" The light pulsed once like a nod, and faded into the blue. She stayed there until the stars returned, thinking of the path that had brought her here. The chamber, the dunes, the boy, the circle of singers, the children at the river. Every moment was still happening somewhere, woven into the same song. There had never been a beginning. There would never be an end. When she finally descended the hill, the valley glowed softly beneath the moon. The hum was there, low and warm, a cradle for everything living. She lay down beside the river, her reflection merging with the stars above, and closed her eyes. Her breath slowed until it matched the pulse of the earth, and in that balance, sound and silence became the same thing. Somewhere, deep in the soil, roots stirred and whispered the vibration onward. Somewhere beyond the clouds, stars turned in rhythm, whispering it back. The world listened to itself, whole and awake. And she, no longer seeking, no longer separate, became another note in the song. The river moved quietly under the moonlight. The surface reflected the sky so perfectly that it was impossible to tell where earth ended and heaven began. The hum ran through the water like a pulse, threading between the stars' reflections and her slow, even breathing. She was no longer sure if she was awake or dreaming. Both states felt like the same part of the same song. From the valley below came the faint murmur of voices. The people who lived there were gathered again, as they did each night, around the fires that burned beside the river. Their songs drifted upward in waves, rising and falling with the wind. There were new tones now, different, more complex, but they still belonged to the same ancient chord. The children who had once played at the river had grown, and their voices carried the strength of new memory. She listened without moving. Every note lifted through her body as if her bones were strings. When she opened her eyes, the stars seemed closer, their light trembling slightly in time with the song. She smiled at the thought that perhaps the universe had been waiting for this harmony since its first breath. The cycle had turned again, but this time it was different. This time, the remembering would not be lost. The next morning, mist hung over the valley like the breath of the world. The woman rose and walked down to the riverbank. A child was there, small and curious, tracing shapes in the sand with a stick. The patterns were familiar, spirals, circles, the geometry that had followed her across centuries. She crouched beside the child and whispered, "Do you know what those mean?" The child shook their head, smiling. "No, they just feel right." She laughed softly, feeling the warmth of recognition. "That's enough," she said. "That's all they ever meant." The child looked at her, head tilted. "Are you going somewhere?" She hesitated. "Not far, just onward." The child nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. They pressed their hand into the damp sand beside the drawings, leaving a small print that filled with water. The reflection of the sky rippled across it, and for a heartbeat, the woman saw her own face there, older, gentler, dissolving into light. When she turned toward the hills, the hum shifted again. It grew softer, more spacious, as if making room for her departure. She began to walk, each step slow and deliberate. The world around her shimmered with morning light, the valley alive with the low rhythm of existence. The people by the fires watched her from afar, though none called out. They understood. They knew that when someone had listened long enough, the world would eventually invite them to become part of its silence. At the crest of the hill, she paused and looked back. The valley stretched below her like a living heart. Rivers gleaming, trees swaying, smoke from the fires curling into spirals that joined the clouds. Every detail moved to the rhythm of the hum. She felt a swell of peace, the kind that has no opposite. "I hear you," she whispered. The wind answered softly, carrying the tone across the land. It touched the fires, the water, the sleeping mountains, until everything vibrated as one. Then the hum deepened, so low it was almost beyond sound. It passed through her chest and into the sky, leaving her weightless, transparent. She didn't vanish. She expanded into the grass, into the air, into the song that had never stopped. The hill, the valley, the river, all sang her name without words, and the melody went on without pause. Somewhere, a new voice joined the chorus, a young one laughing in rhythm, and the sound folded gently into the rest. The hum rose once more, bright and endless, and the world breathed out. The breath of the world flowed outward, and in its wake, the valley shimmered like something newly made. Where her footsteps had been, grass grew, soft, silver green, bending toward the sunrise, as if remembering her movement. The air was lighter. The hum was no longer a tone that came and went. It was a texture in the wind, a quiet presence woven through everything that touched the earth. Down by the river, the people felt it. They paused in their morning routines, their voices fading into silence as the vibration passed through them. The children lifted their faces, eyes wide, listening to something they couldn't name but already understood. It was a farewell that wasn't loss. The world itself was saying thank you. The eldest among them, a man whose hair had gone white under many suns, walked to the water's edge. He cupped his hands and dipped them into the current. When he lifted them again, the water between his palms glowed faintly, the same color as dawn. He turned to the others and said softly, "She's become the sound." No one answered aloud. They only nodded, and each felt the truth of it move through their chest like a second heartbeat. The day unfolded quietly. No one spoke of her departure, because there was no sense of absence. Her presence lingered everywhere. The hum shaped their work, their speech, their rest. It guided the rhythm of the tools in their hands and the breathing of animals in the fields. Life didn't change into something new. It simply remembered what it had always been. That night, when the stars returned, the valley glowed faintly from within. The fires burned lower, but the light above was brighter than any flame. The stars arranged themselves again into the slow-turning spiral, the eye at its center pulsing with the steady rhythm of the hum. It was the same pattern carved into stone, thousands of years before, the same that had risen over the desert, the ice, the sea. Children pointed upward, tracing the spiral with their fingers. The white-haired man smiled and whispered, "She's still listening." And at that moment, the river answered with a deeper note, a sound that seemed to come from the heart of the planet itself. It rolled through the valley, through the roots of trees, through the bones of mountains. The people closed their eyes and let it pass through them, a wave of warmth and recognition. Far beyond the valley, across oceans and cities, the resonance continued. Machines in distant laboratories hummed in perfect frequency for the first time. Wind turbines turned more smoothly. Glass sang faintly in the windows of high towers, and deep beneath the sea, whales altered their songs to match the tone. No, one could explain it, but everyone felt calmer, clearer, as if an invisible hand had straightened the threads of the world. The valley slept. Dreams that night were full of light, soft spirals turning through endless blue. The children dreamed of walking through forests that sang, of rivers that whispered their names, of a voice that said only, "Listen." They woke, smiling, their hands unconsciously tracing circles on the blankets. And somewhere above the clouds, where air thins into silence, the hum kept rising. It moved between the stars like a breath, stretching across the dark until it found other worlds, other skies. Wherever it touched, light stirred. Matter quivered into pattern. Life leaned toward awareness. The universe was still listening to itself, still remembering. In a place beyond the reach of time, the woman felt it all. The turning of galaxies, the breathing of atoms, the slow rhythm of creation replaying itself. She had no form, no boundary, but she could still feel the warmth of the valley, the laughter of children, the sound of rivers on stone. It was all within her now, or perhaps she was within it. There was no difference anymore. And as the hum expanded into the endless dark, it carried a final, wordless truth through every corner of existence. There is no end, only the music between beginnings. The hum moved through the dark, between stars, and touched the thin, bright rims of other worlds. Each planet, sleeping in its orbit, answered in its own tone, low and patient, shimmering like a heartbeat inside glass. The sound crossed space without losing strength. It simply changed color, a wavelength, turning through the black. Where it passed, dust gathered into light, light cooled into matter. Matter began to tremble with memory. Every new world that woke carried a seed of that vibration, a faint echo of the same rhythm that had once flowed through the valley's river. Somewhere on one of those worlds, oceans opened their eyes. Winds rose, mountains inhaled, and the first cells divided to the measure of the hum. Life did not need to be taught. It grew already knowing the rhythm. Each heartbeat, each breath, each motion was a translation of that same sound. The song of remembering had become the blueprint of creation itself. Across ages, civilizations rose again, some of stone, some of light, some of thought. Everywhere the pattern reappeared, spirals carved into surfaces, circles drawn in dust, voices raised to the sky. The people of each world believed they were discovering something new, but in truth they were uncovering the memory of the first vibration. The hum had no origin. It was the thread that held every story together. The woman, now diffused into that thread, moved through it all. She was not a ghost, not a god, only awareness traveling on sound. She could feel the rhythm of new suns being born, the tremor of planets cooling, the laughter of creatures learning to speak. Each tone, each whisper was familiar because it was all part of the same song. Sometimes she would gather herself into a single point, a thought, a note, a shimmer, and appear to those who were ready to listen. They would see her as light reflected on water, as a figure in the corner of a dream, as the flicker of recognition in another's eyes. She would not speak. She would only breathe the hum gently into their silence, and they would remember. One would build temples, another would write, another would simply sit beside a river and hum. The form never mattered, the remembering did. On one distant night, far beyond the world that had been her home, a child sat beside a pool of liquid metal, watching reflections of 1,000 moons. The hum reached her through the air, so faint it was almost imagination. She began to sing with it, her voice small but clear. The surface of the pool trembled, and light gathered above it, shaping itself into the same spiral that had once adorned the ancient chamber on Earth. The child didn't know the meaning of the shape, but she smiled as the pattern burned softly into her mind. Another cycle had begun, and the woman, everywhere and nowhere, listened. The sound passed through her and became her. She felt the endless conversation between silence and creation continue. Breath into sound, sound into form, form back into breath. She understood finally that the hum was not memory. It was love made audible, the universe's way of holding itself together. Every vibration was an embrace, every echo a promise that nothing truly vanished. The stars turned again, slow and patient. Their light folded over itself, forming the same gentle spiral that connected every beginning to every end. And through that turning, the hum went on, soft, steady, eternal, the heartbeat of all that was, all that is, and all that will ever dream itself awake. The hum lingered among the stars like mist, weaving through the galaxies that turned endlessly in their spirals of light. Every world it touched carried the same gentle memory, the same quiet rhythm hidden beneath the noise of time. On some planets it moved as sound, on others as light. In some, it was only the invisible shiver that passed through the smallest particles of air. Yet everywhere, it spoke the same wordless truth, that all things were connected by listening. The woman, no longer bound by shape or name, moved with it, following the resonance as it echoed across creation. Sometimes she felt it pulse like a heartbeat through the fabric of space. Sometimes it was a whisper carried in the gravitational tides between stars. Wherever life began to listen, she was there, not as a presence above, but as the memory that awoke within. 1,000 civilizations rose and fell, their histories folding over one another like ripples in a single ocean. Some built their towers toward the stars, thinking the sky held their gods. Some dug beneath their worlds and found glowing caverns that sang like crystal. Some never built anything at all, but sat in silence, letting the hum shape their hearts. They all belonged to the same melody. On one distant world, a people of light gathered at the edge of a vast ocean that shimmered with reflections of twin moons. They did not speak or sing, but their forms vibrated with color, communicating through waves of soundless resonance. The woman felt their harmony and remembered the valley, the river, the songs of humans beneath the stars. She realized then that no civilization ever truly died. Each one left a faint vibration behind, and those vibrations layered together into eternity's song. Every so often, she would feel the hum bend back toward the world that had first awakened it, Earth. The old planet still turned in its slow dance around the sun, carrying the remnants of its ancient memory deep within. Humanity had changed shape, but their echoes remained. In the rhythm of the oceans, in the laughter of children, in the subtle music of their languages. Even when they forgot, the hum remembered for them. Time, if it could still be called that, folded once more. The spiral drew tight, and the resonance that had traveled across galaxies began to gather again. Like a breath returning to the lungs, the vibration flowed inward, back toward its origin. Far into the future, Earth was quiet. The seas were calm, the sky clearer than it had been for millennia. Ruins stood like bones of memory on every continent, covered in moss and flowers. Nature had reclaimed the world, and the hum moved freely again, no longer drowned by machines or noise. In a clearing surrounded by vast trees, a small group of wanderers had made camp. They carried no technology, no written words, only stories passed through voice and gesture. As dusk fell, one of them, a young girl with hair the color of sand, sat apart from the fire and listened. She could hear something faint beneath the sound of the wind, a tone so soft it seemed to come from inside her chest. She closed her eyes, and the forest breathed with her. The leaves rustled in time with her heartbeat. The fire popped, and each spark rose like a note into the sky. The hum had found her. She didn't know what it was, only that it felt older than the world. When she looked at her reflection in the surface of a nearby pond, the ripples formed a familiar pattern. A spiral, an eye, a circle, Her lips moved before she even realized she was speaking. "I remember," she whispered. The air thickened, warm and electric. The others at the fire turned to look, their faces lit with the same realization, the same calm awe. The hum rose around them like wind through glass, invisible and immense. Across the planet, the vibration spread again. Through forests, through oceans, through mountains, the earth sang its own name once more. In the deep places where magma pulsed like blood, the sound resonated. In the frozen veins of glaciers, it hummed softly. In the bones of every living thing, it trembled like a heartbeat rediscovered. The prophecy was not a promise of an end, it was the sound of renewal. The woman's awareness gathered one last time, drawn back through the spiral of light and memory. She descended through the layers of sound until she felt the planet's surface beneath her, the cool air of dusk brushing her consciousness like an old friend's hand. She stood again, not as a being of flesh, but as shape made of sound and light, faint as mist in the firelight. The wanderers could not see her fully, but they felt her presence. The young girl looked up and smiled, sensing something familiar in the air. The woman spoke, her voice a blend of every tone the universe had ever known. "You have always been the song," she said softly. "Every story, every dream, every breath, part of the same remembering." The girl nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. "It's beautiful," the woman smiled. "It always was. You just forgot how to listen." The wind rose gently, carrying the scent of earth and flame. The woman looked to the sky, where stars burned like notes on a vast sheet of night. "Keep listening," she said, "and you'll never be lost again." Her form shimmered once, the sound within her body dissolving into the air. The hum filled the space she left behind, rising and falling like the tide. The people at the fire felt it pass through them, filling their chests with warmth. And when the night grew quiet again, one by one they began to hum too, softly, without words, echoing the same tone that had traveled through eternity. The vibration spread once more, threading through every living thing. The stars seemed to flicker in response. Somewhere far above, galaxies shifted, turning again in the infinite spiral. The song of creation continued, never ending, never beginning, only remembering itself again and again. In the endless expanse between stars, the resonance of all things moved like a breath, and through it came a final whisper, gentle and certain, from the voice that had always been there since the beginning. "This has been dreams of history, and the dream goes on.